Hi, my name is Catherine Van Tassel, and I'm the Behavioral Health Consulting Director here at GBS. My background, I'm a licensed clinical social worker, a physician assistant, board certified in lifestyle medicine, and today I'm going to present on connection and how it impacts our mental health. I'm really excited to have you guys here today for this presentation. And hopefully there's just one or two things that you can take away from today's presentation that you can take into your life to help you be happier, healthier, and let's get started. So first, I just want to take a bit of a step back and look at how our connection has changed with our community over the years. So if we go all the way back to when we were hunter-gatherers, there were three things that we needed to do to be able to survive, essentially. We needed to procreate, we needed to find food, we needed to find shelter. And it was impossible to do that, all of those things on your own. You needed to be in a tribe, essentially. There were people that helped care for the children or cared for the sick. There were those that hunted. There were those that gathered food, prepared food, helped make shelter, repair shelter. Essentially, if you were separated from your tribe, that was putting your life at risk. You could not survive without your community. Now, if we fast forward to our very changed life in terms of modern inventions and all of the things that we have, think cars and our modern homes with heat and air conditioning. We have Uber Eats that can deliver us food at any time to our doorstep. We don't even need to leave our house, to washing machines and dishwashers and running water. We essentially, for the most part, can live pretty independent lives without needing to rely on anyone else. And we've seen across the years, as each invention continues to be made, that there's a bit of a separation in terms of how much community we have. So this is the good with the bad, right? Definitely good to have all these modern conveniences. However, what we've been seeing in terms of social science in the research is that the more separated we become from our community, the worse it is for our mental health. So we're seeing increases in anxiety and depression, and sadly, even having thoughts of, gosh, it's too hard to be around right now. Maybe it would be better if I wasn't here. And that seems to be increasing as we separate from our connection with others. And how are we seeing that? Well, we know that social scientists love to research the population, and there's always surveys going on and checking out how we're doing. And so this is kind of interesting. Researchers have been following us and looking at how many people that we have that are close. If we needed, let's say we were driving home in the middle of the night and our car got a flat tire, or we were stuck at work and one of our kids needed to be picked up from daycare. How many people would you have in your life that you could call at any one time that would drop everything to come and help you? And a few decades ago, the average answer was about 3 confidants that you could call at any time, come and help you. Or that if you needed a shoulder to lean on or somebody to talk to, you had a person there. You had about 3. However, when they've redone this study recently, the average answer is 0. And I think that this is terribly sad because that it becomes incredibly lonely and very much of kind of, I'm on my own. I don't have anybody to rely on if something happens to me or one of my family members. And this is just, interesting to see in terms of what we're seeing in terms of our health outcomes, mental health and physical health. And one place that researchers have concentrated on is mental health and addiction and loneliness and addiction. We saw very much that during the pandemic, those that were struggling with addiction did worse. And then we also saw this interesting telescoping event, meaning that those that did not have issues with substances that actually changed for them during the pandemic. And what happened is, let's say somebody, for the past 10 years has had one glass of wine once a week with dinner, never had any issues with misusing substances or drinking more than they should. When the pandemic hit, we saw people increase their use of alcohol and of other substances too. But for this example, we'll just talk about alcohol. So that one glass of wine turned out to be 2, and then 3, and then 3 days a week, or 4 days a week. That's what that telescoping phrase means. And what we've seen is that this actually hasn't come down post-pandemic, that people are continuing to drink more and use substances more than they did before. And so there was one study that was done that I think is just really interesting, and this was done in rats. So we have to take this with a grain of salt because rats are not tiny humans. But I do find this really interesting. And when we saw the changes in terms of the substance use community during COVID, this kind of really makes sense. It seems to really correlate here. So scientists did this study where they took two groups of rats, and some of the rats they put all by themselves in cages, so no other rats in there. And then another group of rats they put in just one cage. So lots of friends in there, lots of toys, lots of mates, female mates, male mates, whatever you wanted was in essentially what was called Rat Park. And then both cages had water that was laced with opioids. And what they saw is that the rats that were alone, 100% of them overdosed on the opioid-laced water. However, the ones in Rat Park, they didn't gravitate towards the water and they never overdosed. Now, if they drink it, they might have a sip and then leave it alone. And again, not one overdose, which was completely different to those that were alone. And there's been a lot of talk about this research project and just essentially how community is so important and how we see that it helps us in terms of our mental health. Sarah Silverman has had depression and anxiety in her life, and I just liked this quote that she says when she was talking about her own experience with depression. And she said, "It feels like I'm desperately homesick, but I'm home." And I think for some of us, we can relate to this, not knowing what was going on or feeling like we're just all alone, but really we're not. We're home and in our surroundings. And just can't really pinpoint why we're not feeling well. So I want to talk about, since we're talking about community, what happens to us physically when we're alone? And we're going to look at a couple of different other, two other research studies where scientists have been looking at humans and what happens to our bodies physically when we are lonely. And I think that this is really, really interesting. Okay, so when we're lonely, we'll have an elevation of cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone, and not all cortisol in our body is bad cortisol. What we don't want to have is chronically elevated cortisol. When we have chronically elevated cortisol, as you can see from this infographic, this can impact our immune system. We have elevated blood sugar, high blood pressure. We have a decrease to pain sensitivity, GI distress. This can lead to heart disease. And then we just kind of have this foggy difficulty with memory and attention. And the reason for this is because when we're stressed, I'm sure most of you guys have heard of fight or flight or rest or digest, essentially these two modes of operation in our body. And when we're in this fight or flight, cortisol increases in our body. And what that does is it helps us run from that perceived danger. Like, remember when we were hunter-gatherers and we had to run for our life. And when you had to do that, your eyes would dilate, your vessels would dilate, and your heart would start pumping, and your liver would drop glycogen into your body so that your blood sugar could go up to feed your muscles to be able to run. Well, while you needed all those systems ready to go, what's the one thing you don't need to be doing when you're going to be someone else's dinner? You don't need to be digesting your dinner. And you don't really need to remember all these intricate things when you just need to run for your life. So that's why we see the digestive issues. That's why we see this kind of like fog, difficulty with attention and memory, because we don't need to use those things when we just need to move as fast as possible. And now we're in this modern time where we're not necessarily running from that tiger, but there are so many other areas of stress that we come across every single day. And those are all talking about all of those and how those impact us. That would be for another talk. But for this, we're specifically talking about being lonely. And what researchers have been able to discover, which we'll talk about, is that when we are lonely, when we don't have our community around us, we get an elevation of cortisol. And this is what happens if it goes on and on and on. Okay, so let's look at this. Dr. Lisa Berkman, so she came out of the Harvard School of Public Health, and they followed people that were either isolated or connected over a 9-year period. They wanted to see what happened to them in terms of their mental health, their physical health. And sadly, those that were lonely and disconnected from their community were 2 to 3 times more likely to die. And it wasn't just from one thing. Everything became more fatal to them. So whether it was they had a heart problem or pulmonary problem or cancer, everything became more deadly. What they actually saw is if you had 2 people in this study, both had cancer, but one was more connected and one was isolated, the one that was more connected ended up doing better. Okay, and then what else did we see? So the University of Chicago conducted a study, and what they did is they gave 100 strangers, so these people didn't know each other, 3 things. They gave them a notebook, they gave them a tube to spit into, and a pager. And what would happen is randomly throughout the day, the researchers would page the participants. And when those participants were paged, they would have to do 2 things. They would have to spit into the tube and then write down in their notebook how they felt. So were they feeling lonely or connected? They also were able to track their heart rate so they could see where their heart rate was. This was so interesting. So at times when they were paged and they were feeling lonely, and then they looked at their heart rate and their cortisol, those that were lonely versus those that were connected, their cortisol levels were as physically high as if they were being attacked. So physically attacked, that's how high their cortisol levels were. And again, if we go back to this infographic of having chronically elevated cortisol, these are all the things that end up happening to us physically and mentally, which clearly this is not what we want to have happen. And nothing was happening to those people in that time other than they were feeling lonely or disconnected. Okay, so there's one other thing that I wanted to talk to you about in terms of research studies. And this was out of the University of Chicago, where they were putting people into brain scanning machines. And what they noticed, and they had hypothesized and were able to show this, is that those that are lonely are more hyper alert. And essentially, our brain has 3 structures I'd like to tell you about. One is the frontal lobe, and this is where we make all of our executive decisions. So essentially, all the good things, all the good decisions that we make, our frontal lobe is responsible for that. And then in the middle of our brain is something called the amygdala. And the amygdala is essentially like our watchtower. There is a little guard, I call her Amy, that sits there, and she just is always scanning for potential danger. What do we need to be aware of? When do I need to alert the system that there's danger? And then in the back of your head is your hippocampus. And in your hippocampus, this is where you have memory and attention. So remember when I was talking about when we have elevated cortisol, memory and attention goes out? Well, when we have elevated cortisol levels, we're under stress. So our amygdala has signaled our body that there is stress, and that we need to be aware of it. We get some cortisol in our bodies. There are other hormones we do as well, but just for this conversation, we're talking about cortisol. And so your frontal lobe and your hippocampus don't work as well as they normally do. That's why you get that brain fog, and it's like hard to make decisions sometimes, or you reread the same sentence sometimes. Essentially, the amygdala is warning the whole system, hey, we got to fight for our life. We're going to take some of these other systems offline. Well, what this has to do in terms of this research study is that those that are lonely are more hyper aware of potential threats. And they could see this when they were in the scanning machine. And it was twice as long in terms of being hyper aware and then awakenings in the middle of the night. So they have these micro awakenings, and they happen twice as much as those that are connected. So where do we see people in the world that have the lowest amount of micro awakenings? And this is interesting because the Hutterites there are very few populations now that we can study that work together in a community, spend most of their time in a community. Oh, whoops. Got a little, not sure what happened there. Have spend most of their time in community and have connection. And so the Hutterites are one of these communities, kind of like the Amish or what we see in some of the blue zones. So essentially, they spend all their time working together, worshiping together, eating together, and they have the least amount of micro awakenings out of any population studied. So their brain, what I was talking about, what we saw in this previous study, isn't as hyper aware and always scanning for danger. We also see this in animals that are pack animals, that it's very important for them to stay together. Those that are separated from their pack have all of these awakenings at night because their body senses, I need to be more aware because I don't have those around me to help protect me. Okay, so what are we also seeing in terms of our technology today? So technology is fantastic, but we also seem to be getting more disconnected with some of our technology. So when we look at phones, we see that Americans check their phones every 6 minutes, and teenagers send over 100 texts per day. I think that might actually be a conservative number, but essentially always being on our phone. When we check our phone every 6 minutes, that's because our phones are kind of like these little mini gambling devices. Every time we check our phone, we get a little release of dopamine in our brain, and our brain loves that. That's why it can be very addictive in nature, which tends to be why we check them so frequently. Okay, so just a few stats about social media, which I think is really interesting, is that if we look at the average consumption today in America, and we were to average that out between birth and death, how long would we be on social media over the course of our life? And this is just social media. So this isn't just using your phone for like emails and texts and Google Maps. This is just social media platforms. And the average time would be 6 years and 8 months. That is quite a long time. I think if somebody asked me on my deathbed, I can give you 6 years and 8 months back of your life if you gave up social media, I'm pretty sure I would go to the front of that line to sign up for that program. Now, I don't want to demonize social media altogether because there's a lot of good that comes from that too. People can be in support groups. This may be a way you communicate with family who's out of the country. However, there's some parts of social media that seems to impact us negatively in terms of our mental health. And we're talking about this in this community conversation because when we have community in person versus over technology, that's very different. So think about your friends that you follow on whatever social media platform it is that you like. And what we see is that we see everybody's very curated, perfect life with their perfect vacations and cars and houses and kids or whatever it is that they're showing. It doesn't ever show the other side of it. Versus when you're connected with people in person that you see regularly, that you go to dinner with or go out for a walk with, or you spend time sharing meals in your homes with, or barbecues, whatever that looks like, you get to see the bad and good. You share both of your joys and your sorrows. So think about your friend who may be having infertility issues or is having a struggle with their children or in their marriage. And same for you. You lean on them just like they lean on you. And then you also celebrate the good things as well. But this is very different. We don't have this same interaction on social media. And what we're seeing, especially in younger adults, is the more time that's spent on social media, the worse people feel about themselves and seems to negatively impact their mental health. And this just seems to be getting worse and worse. And the evidence for this is becoming stronger and stronger. So, always what my recommendation here is just taking a little check in and looking at what does this look like? How does this feel? When you're on social media, do you feel bad about yourself after you're using it? Do you feel like you spend more time in that form of communication with your support system versus in person? And how could you change that so that you have more in person, more real life connection versus one way in this curated connection with your community? Okay, so we reviewed what happens to us physically when we're lonely, and how social media can help or hinder our connection, and how to look at that. And I think that the case is very clear that the more isolated or the more disconnected, the worse it is for our physical health, our mental health. That if anyone has had a substance use issue, that it's worse for that, or that we saw an increase in substance use over the pandemic. We talked about what happens to us physically. If you have a diagnosis of diabetes, it's not good to have elevated cortisol. We saw that those that are disconnected are 2 to 3 times more likely to die from all-cause mortality, meaning anything became more deadly. So that was all the bad news. So, but also the case for why I should be invested in changing or doing something different. And so here's the good news. And here at the beginning of this, I said, I hope that you can take 1 or 2 things that you can implement into your life. And one thing I wanted to do is look at where we see the happiest people around the world and what they're doing to be connected. And before we started that, there's just one other population. When we were talking about the Hutterites, I'd also like to introduce you to, and if you wanted to take some time to look into this, this is very, very interesting. So scientists have been studying communities around the world that are called blue zones. So essentially, these are populations, there's concentrations of populations of people that are living to be 100 years or older. But 100 years or older, living in their homes, still able to care for themselves, have their mind and body working well, or pretty well for 100 years old. And why I'm talking about this is there's all sorts of things that they're finding in common with these communities. So these communities can be found in Okinawa, Japan, in Loma Linda, California, and Sardinia, Italy, and Costa Rica. You know, scientists are wondering, what does somebody in Okinawa, Japan have to do with somebody in Loma Linda and Costa Rica? And they found all sorts of similarities with these communities. But for our conversation today, one of those is that they have very, very strong communities. Essentially, if your community didn't see you for one day, they would be walking down to your house to find out what's going on, where you are, and why they didn't see you physically today. So we see from this research that we've been doing to population study of how impactful it is to be connected into your community. And I think also coming out of the pandemic is something that we really saw that too. When we were locked away and couldn't connect with our loved ones, that was really impactful in a negative way for a lot of people, if not every single person. Okay, so what are some good things that we can do? And what do we see for people that are really, really connected? And here will be my invitation to pick one or two things that you could do in your life. So let's look at Denmark. Denmark is one of the happiest populations, and they're very much about being cozy and snuggled in inside. Think cozy dinners and movie nights and having friends come in and bringing food and sharing food and playing games. So I think, okay, this could be something that, once a month you invite your friends over, everybody brings something, and you guys either choose a game to pick or a movie or start a Netflix series together. But once a month, everybody comes in, you light candles, you make food, and you share something together. And maybe this becomes so popular, it could be once a Friday night every week or a couple of times a month. But this would be, okay, Denmark, this is their example. That would be one way that we could bring that into our house today. Or if you look at Germany, very much the opposite of Denmark. So Germany is all about being outside and being active. My favorite saying comes from Germany, where there's no inappropriate weather, just inappropriate clothing, meaning no matter what the weather is, they're outside. And they're very intentional about their socialization. So here I think, okay, this is where you get a group of people, and because in Germany they're so active, maybe you take some sort of fitness class together or take a dance class together, get some couple friends together and take a community dance class, or go to the park and have a barbecue or a picnic. Go to the farmers market. We have winter farmers markets, summer farmers markets. Go into the mountains or to the lakes or whatever areas you have around you to be outside and in nature, and being very intentional about your socialization with others. So here's something for everybody. If you want to be tucked in inside, or if you want to be outside and active, we see these two different countries doing this that really brings their community together. And then in Nigeria, I think that this saying is so beautiful. A person is a person through community. So essentially in Nigeria, they believe that the individual, that their purpose is to be the good for the community. So essentially, their community is these building blocks of each person in there. So it's very separate from being an individualist society. And their other saying is if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think, okay, how do we bring that here for us? And so something that I was thinking about is community service for a couple of reasons. We know that the mental health benefit from doing community service is immense. Essentially, even if somebody is taken to do a community service project against their will, they still have happy hormones released into their bodies. We love as humans to help others, even if we're not sure if we do or not. But we can see that it is really good for us when we do that. And so to be able to exemplify some of this in terms of Nigeria, participating in one of your, in something that's interesting to you. If you like gardening, what about a community garden? Or what if you like animals? Volunteering at a shelter, volunteering in a place where you would meet like-minded people. You'll also likely build friendships there that can then move past that service project that you guys are doing. Maybe that turns in to meeting each other's families or having dinners together or a lifelong friendship. So much of just starting out by volunteering your time for the good of the community will bring you maybe closer to other like-minded people as well. And then in Hawaii, they feel like if you have negative thoughts or hard feelings towards one of your loved ones, that will bring physical illness caused by guilt or anger. And essentially, the cure to this is forgiveness. So they have this like a loving kindness meditation. And if you've never heard the term loving kindness meditation, this is a meditation where essentially you say to yourself that you're fine, that you're safe, and then you say a few words to somebody else that you love, and then you say a few words to somebody that you have hard feelings for. And you're supposed to repeat these in a quiet area. So essentially bringing peace onto yourself, peace onto someone you love, and then peace onto somebody that you have hard feelings for. This meditation is very grounding and centering. If this is interesting to you, you could look up loving kindness meditation. But for Hawaii, their essential meditation is this saying, I love you, I'm sorry, please forgive me, and thank you. And I just want to invite anyone that may be struggling with some hard feelings or have been disconnected from their community for whatever reason that may be, that this be something that you say to yourself or out loud in a quiet space where you're alone, thinking about this person or maybe community. Write this down. And again, taking this mental cleansing from Hawaii and from their belief that holding on to anger or guilt causes physical and mental illness for ourselves. Okay, so hopefully there's one thing that I talked about during this time that you could take into your life. And I think, okay, maybe this is a social media, taking a break from social media for a little bit and seeing how you feel, or changing your relationship with social media, or taking something from the communities around the world that we see are happy and healthy, and noticing the importance of taking time to be connected with our family and loved ones, because it's so important for our mental and physical health. Thinking that, okay, I will have better memory and intention when I spend time with my family and loved ones, or I'm going to help in terms of my physical health, whether that's heart health or vessel health. All of these benefits coming from being connected with others. I hope you enjoyed this. Please feel free to reach out to me anytime. I'm so happy that you took some time to share with me today.